It's still, even after a year of doing this, it's still hard to get used to the silence when you're presenting. Can you see my screen? Emily, is that good? Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm running on behalf of Counterpoints called the Clapham Park Creative Co-op. This is a unique project in the sense that we are working, in terms of online, because we're working within the confines of a neighborhood. So we're working for over a year with the neighborhood on this project about creative storytelling, bringing artists and residents together to tell the story of the estate. And so we were used to working in, in the community center with particular groups that were meeting face to face. So when the lockdown happened, of course, it was, it's a very different approach. So this might differ to some other projects in the sense that our audience, our intended audience, is quite small relative to the wider online audience you can reach. Sorry, here we go. This is just an idea of some of the projects we were running before lockdown, talking about neighborhoods, a lot of photography and encounters in public spaces. We were running a photography club and oral histories. There we go. So when the lockdown happened, we were just about to launch a program of, face-to-face events. So it was quite a shock to us, and we had to kind of regroup quite quickly. After the initial shock wore off, we had to develop an action plan because, part of the challenges for us is that a third of our participants are older, like over 50s, or, even over like 65. And many of them didn't participate online. We ourselves as a project, we didn't have a very well developed social media space because we relied on, physical outreach and neighborhood outreach, which was a very different approach. And we also had to find ways to connect, adapt and connect what we wanted to do into an online and offline audience, because, only half the people were able to run Zoom or even had internet at home. The other people were very disconnected in terms of digitally. So it was very hard for us to actually run our projects that we had hoped to run in that space. I see I've advanced. There's a first mess up. Anyways, that's what I just said. So what we did is we reached out by phone. We are a small team in terms of this. It's just myself and a community producer who's actually a resident on the estate running this. So we redirected a lot of our energy in the first few months to kind of reconnect with people by phone, to check out what people were happy to do. A lot of this actually took a lot of time. Connecting by phone takes a lot of time, but it was really necessary in terms of building trust with people. When the first lockdown ended and we were able to meet face-to-face, we quickly ran some very small group face-to-face workshops to help reconnect with that. We kind of had anticipated there would be another lockdown. We didn't know how quickly or not, but that really helped to kind of reconnect. And we worked with local partners and residents to help share and build out our social media space as well. Sorry. One of the projects we did was we did art kits, which a lot of groups are doing in neighborhoods. So this was, we delivered about 100, hand-delivered about 100 art kits. It was a photo embroidery project where I had photographed a lot of the buildings that were coming down from the estate, and we embroidered. We provided all the materials for embroidery. For us, it was really important that people felt they were contributing to a project and not just doing a one-off. That was a concern raised by people, that they didn't want to just do something by themselves. So we ran Zoom workshops, and we're continuing to run them to help bring people together and embroider together, which was really helpful. And for those that don't have access, we're continuing to follow up with phone, ensuring people feel like they're contributing to something. At the end, we're going to be scanning all of these and producing a big collage at the community center. Another project, we've started doing kind of audio storytelling, where we're recording conversations and stories by phone. And we are starting to do one-on-one walks with people that feel comfortable meeting in that kind of socially distanced space. So we're going to be reflecting on coronavirus, Black Lives Matter, training local story collectors, and developing a storytelling walk and map that people can use once, you know, it's a bit later on down the road. So being able to like connect with people over the phone and use that as a platform for an artwork has been really useful for us, especially and beneficial to people that have been really disconnected from the online space. One thing we're exploring now is how to make the public space more interactive. So people are on their daily walks. We can't do anything in a group, but there's different ways that people can interact with the public space around them. So we're going to start an archive, putting up posters around that people can easily respond to very quickly in different ways, depending on what they have access to. We've applied for funding to do a festival month in July, when we hope that a lot of vulnerable people may have been vaccinated by then and will feel a bit, you know, be coming out, and it'll be a kind of a different phase, not the end of it, but a little bit of celebratory phase of moving forward. So we want to print all the work that we've been developing and collaborate with businesses, local businesses and community spaces to put that work out there so people can encounter it in their kind of everyday space. It's a neighborhood, so, you know, although we've been disadvantaged in terms of like the online media kind of respect, you know, we do have the advantage of being able to encounter our audience in this physical space, which, you know, is difficult if people came from all over the country. Some key learnings, I've already gone over time. Operating in this way, like working online and offline and hybrid, it takes a lot of time and resources, a lot more than it would have if we had just organized events in the community center, for example. So, you know, phone, home deliveries, following up with people. You know, there's been a lot of kind of mental health issues and, you know, people just wanting to chat also in this isolation. So you need to really build in that time for it. For us, it was really important to reach out to people, especially who didn't have access to online. So with every project, we thought about how, you know, we started with how can you reach those most isolated in terms of digitally, and then building the program from there. Obviously, some projects, you know, we had to just make a decision and say this, for this project, only people that have internet at home can participate, but we always make sure to balance it with another project that is specifically targeted to people that don't have internet. The idea of making something together, so collective work has meaning and builds connection with people, rather than just making kind of individual pieces, was really important for us. And I think has helped us encourage people to participate when they were feeling frustrated to do so. And, you know, I think adaptable, for us, it's really important to think about like how, whatever we're developing, is there a way we can adapt it to face-to-face when it's safe to do so? Is there a way that we can, you know, as the lockdown loosens a bit and the regulations loosen a bit, then is there a way that we can start using the physical space of the neighborhood in different ways so that people can kind of encounter each other or encounter each other's stories? So that's it. You're welcome to connect with the project or feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Sorry, I've run through it very quickly. So I'm going to stop sharing now and I'm going to introduce Eleanor Head, who is the head of Imperial War Museum Institute, and she was the director of Refugee Nights.
Thanks, Marcia. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be talking today. So yes, I'm Ellie Head. I'm head of the Imperial War Museum's new IWM Institute, and that is an innovation hub which is rooted in academic research, and it gives historical context to contemporary issues like the refugee crisis. So I'm going to talk today about Refugee Nights, which was the Institute's launch event in November last year, but it was also part of the Imperial War Museum's wider Refugees exhibition season, which opened last year and has been extended multiple times because of the COVID crisis. And when it reopens, I encourage you all to go and visit it. So Refugee Nights was originally conceived as a live event, and we had to take it online at very short notice because of COVID. And IWM although we're a national museum, actually, we don't have an extensive track record when it comes to digital programming. We've usually been quite reliant on people coming into the physical museum and sharing stories and allowing people to see collections. So it was quite sort of risky, and we really were feeling our way in the dark. The festival Refugee Nights was inspired in part by the Tate Nights In, if any of you have seen those. So we programmed it over 3 nights every Tuesday throughout November and into December. It premiered on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and each of the 3 episodes tracked a different stage in the refugees' journey. So we had episode 1, which was life before fleeing in different conflict zones where refugees were from. The second episode was called The Journey, and it tracked different refugees' journeys throughout history. And the third episode was called A New Life ? And it was all about the challenges of settling into new countries. Our media partner for the series was CNN, and they were the media partner on the broader series. And our host was a Syrian refugee called Hasan, which many of you may have come across, who is a fantastic filmmaker. He won a BAFTA for his documentary Exodus. So I'm going to play you a little clip from the festival. I'm hoping it's going to work. Let's see.
My name is Hasan. I am a photographer and a documentary filmmaker. I was one of the people who helped make the BBC documentary series Exodus, Our Journey to Europe. Before I was a filmmaker, I was an English teacher back home in Damascus, where I'm from, in Syria. When Syria, which started as a peaceful revolution against the dictatorship, became a civil war and then turned into a proxy war, there was no reason. I mean, I did not see a solution in the horizon. And the decision to leave to Europe did not come easily. It was my only option. I would definitely go back in a heartbeat if it's safe to do so. Because currently I can't, because the reasons why I left Syria are still there. And if I go back, my life will be in danger.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this important panel, Time for Action. How can the world help refugees?
We have to recognize that we live in an age of displacement. We have more people displaced around the world than at any time since the Second World War. But we also have to get a sense of perspective and realize that the majority of those displaced people are internally displaced and haven't crossed an international border. And it's around 25 million who have crossed the border as refugees. But we also need to understand that most of those, about 85%, are hosted in low and middle income countries. So they're not in Europe, they're not in North America. The numbers coming to Europe and the rich world are actually relatively small, but they're important. It becomes very important that when people flee conflict or persecution, they can flee to safety. They can cross a border to get access to their most fundamental rights.
Hi, Singi.
Hey, how are you doing?
It's great to meet you.
It's really wonderful
And
to meet you.
welcome to IWM London.
Yeah.
I tell you a little story. I tell you about how it changes. The men got all the glory. Rhythm is a place of freedom, but if they don't know, then they won't grow. The seeds we sow are far from ours.
Great. So there we go. I'm not going to spend too long on impact and audience response because I want to talk more about the kind of mechanisms behind the series, but I think it's safe to say it really surpassed our expectations in terms of the response that we had. So we had 10,000 views of the series, which is still growing. We had about 750 registrations per episode, and The Economist called it one of the most ambitious projects by a British museum during lockdown. Which was the kind of holy grail of reviews, and given that it was the first time we'd ever done anything like this, we were really thrilled. So the question today that I want to answer is, how did we manage to create an engaging online event and against the odds during COVID? So I'm just going to give you a few quick sort of key learnings, a bit like Marcia, that hopefully will help all of you if you're trying to do something similar. So I would say that the most important thing was we learned from previous mistakes. So in the first lockdown in March, we put on a series called Reimagining Victory, a digital series, which was coinciding with VE Day, and it was about exploring how the concept of victory and winning wars has changed since the Second World War. And we effectively did a series of talking heads on Zoom. It was long form content. We had 6 episodes. It was a relatively basic production because we didn't really have a huge amount of budget, and it had quite a sort of homogenous feel. So it just meant really that we didn't get the kind of engagement and traction that we wanted. And we did a big evaluation report around that series and then applied it to Refugee Nights. So this time we tried to take the opposite approach. So we really went for variety and also pithiness. So we had 3 episodes rather than 6, and we went for a magazine style structure. So we were kind of inspired by things like Newsnight or The One Show, where you have one continuous presenter, but then you have short featurettes. And then we felt like you got the balance between being able to cover a lot of subject matter and cover the complexities of the refugee experience, but you kept people's attentions because you were constantly varying the styles and the pace of the kind of content that you were producing. So we really tried to make sure that our contributors and the kind of subjects we were tackling were incredibly diverse. So we had speakers who varied from public policy experts to academics to film stars. We had people like Jude Law and chefs, Imad Alanab, who's a Syrian chef who has a restaurant in Carnaby Street in London, and people from all around the world. And that was one of the benefits of doing this online rather than having to do it in the museum and being restricted to UK. So we really tried to keep people guessing. That was the key in terms of what kind of content that we were going to roll out, and each episode was slightly different. So learning from previous mistakes, number 1, and applying them effectively. A personable and authentic host to your online event. We chose Hasan because he was an authentic person with first-hand experience of the refugee crisis. We could have gone for a slick media presenter, someone from CNN who was our media partner, but we really wanted to avoid the common problem of othering when it comes to refugees. So one set of people talking about another set of people's problems, and we didn't want to kind of perpetuate the victim narrative around refugees. So Hasan really challenged that perception and approached presenting with humour and a really kind of gave the whole series a real kind of positive and celebratory tone. And he was the kind of common thread that linked the series. So think carefully about who your host is and who your frontman is. Sponsorship, sadly, I wish it wasn't the case, but it really does make a difference. So we did manage to get a sponsor for this series, which was a law firm called McFarlane's, and it really enabled us to dramatically upgrade the quality of our production. And that included the film crew we used, the editors we used, and the digital marketing strategy that we employed. So it's not a deal breaker, but it does help. And then in terms of other strategic partnerships, so we thought carefully about who we wanted as our partners, from programming partners who provided us with contacts and links to speakers, and also footage. So we worked with the Disasters Emergency Committee and the International Organisation for Migration, who had a wealth of content of clips from refugee camps in Moria and Lesbos, and it meant that when we were putting the series out, it was effectively B-roll footage, so we were able to kind of weave it into the series, and it just kept the pace and kept engagement with our audience. And then our media partner was CNN, so that, and we were lucky because that was already the case for the bigger exhibition season, but it dramatically extended our reach. So it meant that we suddenly had a global reach, and we were able to kind of piggyback on CNN's huge PR machine, which was fantastic. And then I think finally, well, a couple more things and then I'll wrap up because I'm sure I've gone over time as well. Ironically, I think COVID was great for us in terms of this particular series because it forced us to really have to think outside the box. And because nothing had been done like that in the museum, we just had to be really experimental and even more creative than usual, and it pushed us in a way that we didn't expect. So we really tried to kind of make the best of a situation, and the urgency can be stressful, but it can also force you to be innovative. And I think finally, the platform is important to think about. Where are you putting out this series? What kind of audience do you want? How do you get the greatest amount of engagement? So we had a toss up between doing a live stream on YouTube or doing a premiere. And live streams are incredibly expensive, and they are also incredibly risky. And if you're working with a presenter who doesn't have a lot of media experience, you're really making life more sort of difficult for yourself. So we decided that a premiere was the perfect halfway house, because it meant that at a certain time on a certain evening, everyone sat down and it felt like you were attending something live. It was this shared kind of captive moment with a countdown. And there was a YouTube comment section where our digital team were constantly feeding questions to our audience, such as, what's the hardest thing about the refugee crisis? Or if you were living in exile, what would be the greatest challenge for you? Or what would you take with you if you had to leave at the drop of a hat? And we had lots of really thoughtful debates and discussions from our audience on the YouTube comment section. So not quite a substitute for being there in the flesh, but it wasn't a bad alternative. So that is a very sort of quick run through of what I would strongly recommend if you're thinking about doing an online event. It's not rocket science, but it's about constantly learning. And anyway, I hope this has been useful, and I'll answer questions right at the very end. So thank you, Marcia.
Thanks, Eleanor. That was fantastic, and there's a lot of stuff to think about, even post lockdown, I think there. So now we're going to bring it over to Kezieh Berelson, who's the co-artistic director of Mafwa Theatre, and Anne Collins, an associate artist at Mafwa Theatre.
Thank you. I couldn't find it when I was sharing. So I'm now unmuted. Yeah, I'm Kezieh. I'm the co-artistic director of Mafwa Theatre here in Leeds. And I'm here with Anne, who is one of our associate artists. Thanks so much to Counterpoints for having us. We are really excited today to share with you a little bit about Cooking with Parveen, which was a project that we started all the way back in October 2019, but that changed really dramatically over the course of the pandemic. So Mafwa Theatre is a community theatre organisation we've been running since February 2018, and we work across migration statuses. So we work to create creative communities based on solidarity and collaboration. Cooking with Parveen was supposed to result in a play, a performance here in Leeds in Refugee Week actually of last year. Obviously that didn't happen. We changed what we were going to do really substantially and ended up producing some fantastic outcomes and really deepening our relationship with Mafwa members. So I'm going to hand over to Anne now to talk a little bit about how we changed the project.
Hello, my name is Anne. I'm from Mafwa Theatre. From March to July, we used to receive a weekly packs, which includes a recipe and a letter from a Mafwa member, a creative activity, a physical activity, and a stamped and addressed envelope where we could send our recipe and creative activities. Well, pack also includes food voucher to make our recipe more delicious. Yeah, we were also on the WhatsApp group where we posted our recipe, and it's quite interesting, encouraging one another. We also recorded our podcast, which included people who doesn't have access to WhatsApp. We also recorded them over phone. Yes, we created a book using the activities in the pack, like poem, stories from our kitchen, our recipes, and it was sent out to everyone who took part in the pack. We created a short film with Hope, in which Mafwa member took part. It was really interesting film. We took part in sharing recipe from our kitchen. And in August, we had a picnic together as our celebration. It was only the time where we meet in person.
Thanks so much, Anne. So Cooking with Parveen was meant to be a play about food and femininity, working with our women's group that meets every week. In October, between October and March, we were doing live cooking sessions as well. So every member from the group would demonstrate on a weekly basis a recipe that they loved, and we'd then do some theatre while it was bubbling away on the stove, and then have a massive meal all together. It was really hard when that had to stop. But the reason that we were able to effectively change the project is that we are a participant-led organisation. So the weekly welfare phone calls that we started to do throughout the pandemic meant that we knew that we, as a staff and volunteer team, didn't have the digital skills or knowledge to be able to effectively support people with digital access. So we went completely analogue. We spent the summer upskilling our team of volunteers and staff members, working really closely with the Tech Ladder and 100% Digital Leads to get funding in for data and devices, as well as finally, we did actually manage to meet up in early December to deliver some digital workshops. What's really important to us about Cooking with Parveen was the idea that we refuse to make art with people who are hungry. And we were able to work closely with our funders and pop in a £5 food voucher with, as well as a bus ticket, with all of those creative packs that went out. It really shaped the way that we radically thought about working with communities, and we're now working to restructure the organisation to make it as flat as possible. Being responsive enabled us to create these fantastic outcomes, and taking a multi-art form approach, walking away from traditional theatre and making a podcast, a film, a recipe book, was really fantastic and enabled us to reach more audiences. And now we have finally at a stage where we can run digital sessions, but always with a real foot in the ground of sending out postal packs. So for example, we're working on the moment on a clay project, and everyone gets a clay pack with instructions in. So if you aren't able to join in online, you can have those instructions, which are then followed up by a phone call. It's been really interesting, and I really look forward to what the future brings. So thanks very much. Do keep in touch, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Kezieh and Anne. Those were great. What a great project. I love that gif of Parveen. Is it Parveen on the cycle?
It's actually, it's Samira. I don't think Parveen can cycle.
Okay, it was brilliant. So I apologize to everyone because we've gone slightly over time. It was too interesting to stop. So we have a bit of time for some Q&A. Originally it was 15 minutes. I'm going to bring it down to 10 minutes so we can continue on with the sessions. But at the end, we have some extra time so that we can have more Q&A if people want to. So we have 10 minutes here. I've got some questions that have already been put in the chat, and if you have more, please continue to do so. So I have a few questions for Eleanor. These questions are in terms of demographic groups. So do you know who viewed it? Do you have an idea about the regional or global audience reach? And what does that mean for the future of IWM events?
Great question. So important. So I can tell you who actually viewed it, and then I can tell you who we wanted to view it. So the Imperial War Museum is going through a really interesting times in terms of its audience focus. We segment our audience and we give them different names. So we have our time teamers, who are our kind of slightly more mature audience members, and then we have culture vultures and middle youth, who are slightly younger, culture loving section, and then we have our thrill seekers who love Duxford and all our air shows. And the culture vulture sort of slightly younger demographic are our development audiences, and they really are the ones that we are trying to bring into the museum more and more. And that is why we are focusing increasingly on contemporary issues like the refugee crisis. But for example, in the future, we're going to do a season on war video games. So Refugee Nights was specifically aimed at our development audience, at this sort of younger culture-loving group. But it's difficult because we have a very loyal time team of following, and they really dominate things like our YouTube subscribers, our Twitter followers, our Instagram followers. So I saw another question in the chat, which I'm happy to answer as well, which is about the digital marketing strategy. And we really had to aggressively try and target viewers outside our existing subscriber base. I think in the end we had 40%, we worked out roughly, of the viewership was made up of that development audience, and 60% was made up of the sort of time teamer audience. In terms of region, we don't actually have good data analytics on that, but because we partnered with CNN, who are a US media outlet, then we had a good viewership in the US. And then also one of the panels, which I encourage you all to watch, which was hosted by Becky Anderson, who's the CNN anchor out in Dubai, that was broadcast by CNN Arabia. So we had a very good Middle Eastern viewership. So it was great because it meant it was viewed globally. I think a huge learning for us is, if we need to invest in anything at the museum, we need to invest in our kind of digital analysis team and really focus on understanding data analytics when it comes to digital programming more, because we're so far behind the private sector when it comes to that. So it really highlighted, I think, our kind of inadequacy there. So I hope that answers that question.
Wonderful. We have another question that I'm going to invite Kezieh and Anne to reply to, and I can add anything if there's anything new to add. But it's a really good question, actually, because the question is, we have a lot of young men at our project. Have young men joined in with the embroidery or cooking projects? And any ideas for projects attractive to this demographic, please?
Yeah, so I can take that first. So at the moment, we're only working with women. So we're a women's only group. That's inclusive of women and non-binary people as well. We would really like to extend our work to men, and also we've started working with young people with collective encounters, and that's not gendered. I don't think that any people any members in Mafwa think that cooking is a strictly female activity, but for us, it just felt like something that kept coming up. People kept bringing in food, kept wanting to cook with each other. So it made the most sense for us as to what we were going to go with as the focus of the project.
I can say, I mean, our project, for example, in Clapham Park, we are not, necessarily targeted to just women, but obviously the embroidery and people that were interested in being part of the creative part in the beginning, just happened to come from this demographic. Obviously, embroidery is not something that men generally naturally gravitate to in this kind of context. I think it would have been different if we were in the community center and people could experiment without necessarily committing. It might have been a bit different, but that is something that we're looking into now. So we're restarting the photography club, and that's through having spoken to men that we'd previously been working with about what they'd be interested in, and photography is something that seemed a lot more accessible. So it hasn't been easy, and it's definitely something that we are constantly on the lookout for ideas. A potential, I think theater perhaps might be something that men might be more interested, at least in the kind of demographic, the areas that we're working in. So yeah, I think that's been a challenge for a lot of projects, to be honest. Other people in the breakout rooms, that might be something that people might want to chat about as well. I'm going to give it a few more minutes here with questions because there's so many good ones. One question is about digital platforms. So obviously Zoom is the go-to, but when using digital platforms, which have you found work best? And this may be different for different communities. Do either of you want to start with that? Have a response to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. It's an interesting one for the Imperial War Museum, because we're a national museum and we're public sector. There are so many security sort of loopholes that we have to jump through, and we have this big sort of IT security team. So Zoom has not been deemed as secure. by our IT team. I'm not sure whether I necessarily agree with that, because I think it's the one that the government uses and Parliament uses. So I kind of feel like if it's good enough for Parliament, it's good enough for the Imperial War Museum. But anyway, that's not the chosen one. So we use Microsoft Teams, and that's deemed as being the most secure for sort of more informal sort of creative programming. And then Crowdcast is another one that we've used quite regularly, which I would really recommend. Actually, I think it's very user friendly. It's very straightforward, and it is secure as well. And then for Refugee Nights, because it was all pre-recorded, then YouTube was just the place where we put it out. So we do a sort of mixture of live programming and pre-record, but yeah, Crowdcast and YouTube are the ones we tend to go for.
We've found Zoom to be really beneficial. I think there are obviously concerns around security and safeguarding, but we've done what we can within our risk assessments and online Zoom guidelines and online safe working practices to sort of assure against that. But I think that especially working with people who have lower digital skills or might be struggling with English as a second, third or fourth language, working with Zoom is really useful, because it's what they'll be working with in all the other work they're doing as volunteers or as service users or in their professional employment. So it just makes sense.
And I just want to chat, because I saw in the, if anybody's following along with the chat, actually it's super fascinating, and people have been showing ideas about projects that involve men, but also about their experience with the Zoom and things. But one question is about experience with people calling into Zoom. So that's something that we've started experimenting with, which has been really interesting as well. So people, if they don't have digital access, you can still use a phone number and call into Zoom and participate on the phone. You do need, we found that you do need to test it out a bit, because experiencing it on the phone is obviously very different than being able to see things on the screen. But you can do it. You just need to be conscious of what that person on the phone is able to experience and see. But it is working well for our embroidery a bit, because people, they're part of that conversation. So that's something, I'm not sure if the other digital tools accommodate that, but I think that's something that's really useful to explore. In correlation to that, and I might invite Emily and Tom to also contribute to this question, but a question around security and what do you do to avoid being disrupted by Zoom bombing or social media trolls and things. That's obviously something that Refugee Week has, been contending and planning for. Emily and Tom, do you want to jump in as well with your experience?
Yeah, Tom, you go.
People are already sharing some of the links in the chat. I think probably best to say we could share something after this meeting. We did it. We've done it throughout since sort of March last year, and so some of this guidance has developed. There are some quite simple steps you can take, and also just some emergency measures you can have in mind. Yeah. So we'll send some links. The main thing is to be prepared, I think, and to think through who's at risk and what the risks might be, as Kezieh said, in terms of risk assessment, and then to think what you're going to do. And someone said to me at one point, their nuclear option is just to end the meeting if anything goes really badly wrong. So you can always get people back in again. But anyway, that's the kind of end line. But we'll send something afterwards. It's part of the follow-up to this meeting.
And I think just to add to that, probably the single biggest thing is just to make sure you're not sharing Zoom links publicly. So not on a public Facebook page or a Twitter. Obviously, Zoom bombing and harassment can happen. For Refugee Week last year, there were 350 events online, and there was one example of a horrible kind of Zoom bombing, and that happened because the organizer had posted the Zoom link on Twitter. So what we do for our events is we ask people to sign up during Eventbrite. So you've got, there's a step that people have to take in order to take part. Obviously, there's, if that's accessible to people, and then we're emailing out the Zoom link. So it's just, having control over what happens to that link and how widely it gets shared.
It's important to note that it's very, very important probably to have someone backup on if you're running Zoom sessions or kind of these online workshops, because the facilitator is only able to do so much, but someone who's monitoring to see if there's anybody jumping in with messages and things that can quickly react is really important. Eleanor, Kezieh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think, yeah, I would say having backup is really useful, and also having multiple support. So someone really focusing on, because there are real benefits to Zoom where you do have really difficult things coming up. You can mute people. It's a pretty impressive power. You can kick people out. But it's what concerns me sometimes around Zoom is that when people are struggling in a group because of stuff that's going on at home that they're bringing into the session, or stuff that's happening in the session, it's really nice to have a breakout room set aside, like pre-made up, where people can go with a leader or someone facilitating the session to just chat through that. And yeah, as Tom said, it's all about planning ahead and making sure that those contingencies are in place.
We have time for one more question. And Eleanor, I think this is particularly directed to your work. Could you tell us a little bit more about your digital marketing strategy for the event, and what did you find were the main sources of awareness? And especially, to what extent do you think you were able to reach people who were not already sympathetic to refugees?
So that links back to the part of my presentation when I said learn from past mistakes, because we had tried a certain type of digital marketing strategy for Reimagining Victory, and all that happened was it was incredibly time intensive without much kind of return on investment. So for Reimagining Victory, we created a lot of short form video content that was shareable on social. So we got speakers to do little pieces to camera, and we got our editors to kind of do mashups and all that kind of thing. It took such a long time, and actually it didn't really fly in the way we'd hoped. So for Refugee Nights, the other R, we decided to do much less, but to try and make that content work harder. So instead, I think we had perhaps 4 kind of core pieces of short form content. It was the same kind of content, it was sort of pieces to camera. So I think with Hasan, we had him doing a piece to camera, just sort of teeing up Refugee Nights and saying what it was and asking people to join him. Lasted something like 20 seconds. But then we really tried to make that piece of content work hard by asking all of our partners, so our 5 partners on the series, and all of our speakers to share it. To share it with their networks on social, and then for us to share it, and then for our friends to share it. And that kind of sharing and resharing and resharing and resharing, we found generated far more traction and far more engagement than it did when we saturated our platforms with content. So I think that's definitely something that we learned: less content, more shares, and then also paid marketing. So for this time around, we had a little bit more budget, and because we were sponsored, and I deliberately carved quite a considerable amount of that budget out to go on paid Facebook marketing. And we had a digital team that it's incredibly sophisticated, is way beyond me how it works, but trying to make sure that the people that we were attracting through paid marketing were ones that weren't just interested in refugee crisis, but perhaps were interested in current affairs, or they read The Guardian, or we tried to think quite sort of laterally about the kind of people that we were targeting. So that was the strategy. But as I say, I think if we wanted to really invest in manpower in the museum, I think a digital marketing expert or 2 would really benefit us. And I think we've still got so much more to learn, but anyway, I think we're going in the right direction.
Super. Well, just in the interest of moving things along, we can come back to some Q&A afterwards. When we come back from breakout rooms, we have a bit more time, but just to make sure, for those of you that will have to leave earlier, that we have a chance to speak with each other. So we're going to be put into breakout rooms, about 5 people per breakout room. So this is just an opportunity to chat with